Hi folks, hope you're well out there. If you happen to be hosting services on a virtual private server, a VPS in the cloud, and you're using Docker containers to host those individual services, then this is probably a video you really want to have a look at, because it appears actually that Docker containers, when you configure and set up and change, especially port mappings, they are punching a hole right through your firewall out to the internet, which really leaves your containers exposed to the outside world. Even though you have configured your UFW, your I think it's uncomplicated firewall, to block certain ports, those ports are being opened up to the outside world. And I discovered this with shock the other day when I was configuring Cloudflare to manage my DNS for my hosting. The reason why I was doing Cloudflare really was not just for the DNS service, but the caching to improve performance on my site, also the obscuring of IP address, so you don't see my actual hosting IP address at all. You see a Cloudflare IP address. And of course the added security where they are managing a lot of the traffic and the vulnerabilities and risks and so on. Yes, I know, this is the end user here. You are breaking the SSL. There is a man in the middle essentially, but I don't have anything that's severely private for users' registrations or anything on my sites. They're mostly public sites. What I'm really trying to do is protect the sites from attack. So I'm just illustrating the problem over here on this particular slide and showing that this is how you expect things to work. You as the end user are coming through with your SSL bouncing, whether you're using Cloudflare or not, doesn't really matter, just through any DNS. And you will be, for the home hosting at the bottom here, this is not really such a problem. And neither is something maybe like, say, DigitalOcean, where you've got a specific firewall, a physical firewall or virtual firewall that you're managing separate to your actual hosting. So if you were to come in from here, go through this domain, you'd hit, for example, at my house, you'd hit my router, which manages the firewall. And whatever is happening here on the inside with the container side on the server, it doesn't matter because it does not affect the router's firewalls. And the same goes, for example, like I said, with DigitalOcean. Whatever you're changing on the container side does not punch holes through that firewall. The firewall is completely separate. But you can see here in this top instance, at this domain that I've got on a VPS, it's a different situation because the VPS is essentially one machine. It's got a couple of containers running that I've configured. I've got the UFW firewall sitting in front over here, and I had shut down and denied all ports apart from 8443 and 1194, which is for my VPN login. But what I was not aware of was that as you configure these containers over here and you set up certain port mappings and so on, you've got an external port for each container and its internal port for the container. The problem is, as you power this up, although your UFW, if you look at the status, is still showing that you've just got those couple of ports open, essentially from here, this external port is being created through an IPTable chain and opening up a path right through. So IPtables essentially have what they call chains, and a chain determines different types of routing through the firewall, or for to containers, networking in general. UFW only manages its little portion, which you'd think was everything, but no, it is not. So there's also a chain created called Docker. I think it's called Docker. And essentially what then is happening is it's opening this route up. Now look, this is a convenience because think about it. You're coming in here, it's got to find a path through to the relevant container, and from the one container, the reverse proxy, in this case Nginx Proxy Manager, has to route through to the other containers as well. So the convenience factor is that Docker is taking care of this for you, which is great. So it opens everything up. But the thing is also it's opening external ports which you don't want opened. And to me, the worst is you're not even aware of it, because if you're checking your UFW status, you don't see those ports are opened. I'll show another command on the next slide or so showing how you can check this. But it is a known issue, and I've seen a lot of debate about it, but it's back-end sort of technical debates that the guys are going on about, but this needs to have a better solution and it's a problem and that sort of thing. But the thing is, for most new Docker users and sort of casual home hosters and that sort of thing, a lot of us are not aware of this problem. So it was to my shock and horror when I was actually looking at setting up the Cloudflare in more detail that I discovered this is the problem actually that I'm sitting with. So I was thinking my ports are blocked. When I did an actual test and I was checking again, I realized no, they're not. If you type in the IP address of my VPS with, say, colon whatever it was, 443 or whatever the case is, then what you discover is you could directly access those containers. And that means you're bypassing also the Nginx Proxy Manager, which is not what you want. So the question really is, first of all, how do we detect and see what's going on, whether we've got this problem or not? And then obviously, what can we do to fix it? So let's have a look first at how we can check. So as I've said before, if you, and most people are using UFW as the firewall by default because it's so simple and easy to use, if you type in sudo UFW status, you'll get back something like this. And the problem is, this is now what's deluding a lot of people. You're looking at a couple of ports, only a couple of ports that are open, and you think, wow, great, all fine. This is the command you actually want to be looking at. SS stands for secure stats, SS-LTPN. And this is going to return something a little bit different. And now you'll see, I did the query on the same machine at the same time. You'll see over here a couple of interesting things. These are the ports that are being listened to at the moment. These are external to the containers. But here's a slight difference. Where you're seeing 0.0.0.0, that is actually a port that's open to the world. In other words, it's fully publicly exposed. And you'll see that there again. The 443 is allowing that. But these ones, the 127.0.0.1, that's a local address, local host, local machine only. Yes, there is a port 7000, but it's restricted only to the local host being able to use it. In other words, it's not open to the whole world. And that really suggests to us partly what the solution is here, or one of the very simple solutions. If we can restrict containers to not punching that hole through the firewall and only allowing the local host to access them, that is really going to sort of solve the problem. The reason is because we've got about sort of three generic sort of options to deal with this. Obviously, as I pointed out already, if you've got a home router firewall, or you've got a VPS, a proper VPS firewall, like say DigitalOcean and certain of those services have got, that's the easiest, because all you do is you just got to make sure what is open on that, what is closed on that, maybe just test it yourself externally, and that's as far as you need to worry about it, nothing further. However, like I said, if you've got a VPS, which is a plain pure VPS just sitting on the internet, you've got a small problem if you are using Docker containers. One option would be possibly to disable Docker adjusting the firewall ports. Now that can be done. It's a 1 or 2 line command to do it, but it's really not recommended unless you are very, very familiar with IPTables, which I'm not. Because after that, you've got 2 or 3 pages worth of different commands you've got to go through to open up and close and root and make sure that the tables are all working for the containers. So I can see the reason why Docker manages it on your behalf. It does make it very easy and seamless. So for most general users, that's not really an option. So I come then to number 3, which is what I've been making use of now. And this is to me the simplest. You can understand what's going on. You can check it fairly easily, and it's very easy to implement as well. What we're doing is we're restricting the container's external port only to the local host. So by default, when you just say map a port to a container, you've got an external port, an internal port. When you put the external port in, by default, in front of that, you could visualize it's got a 0.0.0.0. In other words, open this port through the firewall. That's the default. However, if you put this in front and append it, then you can actually prevent that remapping of the IP tables. So how do we do it? Well, I'm using Portainer, but even if we're going to be using a Docker Compose file, it's essentially exactly the same thing. Normally what you'll do is if you open Portainer for any container that you've got already running, you'll see over here under manual network port publishing, you'll see there's just an address, say it's 7,000. And on the right hand side, this is the container's own internal port, which it's listening to internally, which would be 80 or 443 or whatever the case is over there. We don't have to worry too much about that one. What you're worried about is the outward facing, or the port the container is listening to on the outside of the container for its traffic coming in. All you have to do is append in front of the 7000 the 127.0.0.1 with a colon. So in essence, it will be then restricting it to the local host. It's very much the same for the Docker Compose file, where you had, I think it was a -p for ports, and you had 7000:80. You will now have all three of them in a line, 127.0.0.1:7000:80. And that will effectively achieve the same thing. So if you're creating new containers, that's the way to go. You just put all three in. If you want to adjust this after you've got a container already running, that's not very difficult. You go to something like Portainer, you'll go click on containers, open your container, and you'll see an option that says duplicate edit at the top of it. You click on that and this screen will come up. All you have to do is make this change and click to say deploy the container. What it will do is it will just recreate the same container but with its adjusted settings, and that's really it. End of problem. And your containers will no longer punch. In fact, it'll also automatically close what it had previously punched through that IPTable firewall. So once you've got that done, what will happen is the question is going to be really, how do I then access those restricted containers? Remember that your Nginx proxy, obviously, and your VPN container are still going to be exposed, because those are the ones you're going to want to probably log into from external. But if you need to access those containers, especially your management containers like Portainer, Nginx Proxy Manager's own dashboard, your maybe PHP admin, and a couple of those things, then the way you can do it is there's two different ways. If you're at home and it's a service that's running at home, you're obviously already on that LAN. So what I'd suggest is it's very easy. You just now in future use your internal IP address for your server, where your Raspberry Pi, wherever your service is running, with the relevant port to access the service. And that's it. You just type that in your browser and you go. The other way is if you are away from home and it's a home service, what you're going to do is, the easiest way to do it is you just set up on your router. Most routers will support a VPN service, something like OpenVPN usually, and sometimes there's 2 or 3 other options as well. Configure that so that you can log in, because if you log in to that using, say, OpenVPN, you're dropping yourself into the LAN as if you're in the house. Then it's exactly the same thing. You log in with the VPN, open your browser, type the same local internal address, and you'll have the service up and running. So that's the easiest if you're sitting at home. If you've got the VPN out on the internet, what you're going to want to do is, I set up a VPN service as one of my containers. I used OpenVPN, so I've got a container set up already. What I'm essentially then doing is, and that container does still have its port exposed to the internet, because I've got a very, very strong password on that container. Then I am using a VPN again. I'm logging in, and I've set up my home network already, but it's basically just one click and I'm logging into the VPN. Then I'm also again on that local network inside the VPN. And what I then use to access the container, say for example, the Nginx Proxy Manager's container, I would use its container IP address, colon, with the port, the internal port that the container is listening on. So 81, for example, for Nginx Proxy. If it was the, say, Handel or whatever other service, same thing. I'd use the container's IP address, colon, and its internal port that the container is listening on, not its external port. In fact, you don't even have to have an external port switched on at all for the containers. You can actually just use the IP address and its internal port number. That, by the way, is also a tactic that I'm using for a lot of my containers. I don't have an external IP address at all exposed, not even to the local host, in fact, because if you're coming in through something like Nginx Proxy Manager, you don't always have to specify the container IP address and port number to access it. You can actually even just use the container name, and port number to access it. That's one of the advantages of Docker, and then you really got your containers isolated. So really, in summary, this is sort of what I've done now to sort of more secure the traffic is, as I said, I've moved from my plain DNS service to CloudHost, mainly so that I could obscure the IP address completely of my hosting VPS. Cloudflare is also doing a lot of vetting of the traffic and so on as well, which my plain DNS service was not doing. That's just something to consider. Then I do have a reverse proxy manager container where all traffic on port 80 and 443 is only going to that reverse proxy container. So everything is managed through that container. On the firewall side, for the UFW, I've only got ports 22 for SSH, 80 and 443 are open and they're going to the proxy manager, what's listening on those ports, should I say. And I've got 1194, which is the default port for a VPN service, are open. That's it. Then the other key part that goes with that, because again, remember, we want to prevent other holes being punched to the firewall, is I restrict containers external ports to 127.0.1. So that means none of the containers will be punching holes through the firewall. That's all of them, except for the reverse proxy and the VPN container, because we still need to access those from the outside. So they will still just have the normal port 80 and port 80, port 443, 443 for those. It's only those two containers that is an exception. But just take note though, for example, on the reverse proxy, it has 80 and 443 open, but 81 is still being restricted to the local host. The reason is because that is the IP address that brings up the dashboard to manage the reverse proxy. So if you still had that exposed, that means anybody could get to the login for your dashboard. So just bear that in mind there. And then you can also, I said this is optional really, but even your public services like WordPress and Nextcloud and that sort of thing, you don't have to have an external port, because remember, if they're coming through the reverse proxy, what I said before is the reverse proxy can point to a container just by using its container name and the port. So if you really want to be a little bit cautious, which I suppose you should also be, consider otherwise using just the container name and port to do the routing in your reverse proxy, and you can still restrict those as well, because you're not going to be wanting to expose those directly. You want to force everybody through the reverse proxy to access those services. And then the last thing is you must just use a VPN service to gain access as the local LAN user. That's so that you can use those plain IP addresses without having to. So in other words, you're not going to have these services, especially your management services, they're not going to have them exposed through your DNS and domain names servers really. So there again, like I said, OpenVPN is an option. There's different VPN, whichever is going to be easier for you to set up as the VPN server side. So sometimes your router will determine whether you must use OpenVPN or whatever the case is. And maybe the last thing just to mention, yes, it sounds silly, but you do need to test it. I had made an assumption myself. Once I'd shut the firewall ports down on UFW, I just assumed, well, they're now closed. They're not open anymore. And look what happened. Well, nothing happened, but it could have happened. So test it. So obviously, if it's a VPS, you can just use your actual IP address of your hosting server with the port number for WordPress, Nginx Proxy, whatever, and just test to make sure that you can't get it. If it's at home, you can use one of the remotes. There are scanners on the internet, various services. Just go search for remote port scanning, and you'll find services where you can type in your home IP address and then you can just check and verify again whether any of those ports are visible or not. They should not be visible. So yeah, I hope that sort of was of interest to some of you. Certainly, as I said, if you're new to container hosting on a VPS especially, then this may be of interest to you. Unfortunately, like I said, couldn't really go into a step-by-step tutorial because everybody's setups are slightly different. This was really intended just to be a sort of a generic overview of what the problem was and to point you at the right sort of solutions to look at really to solve the problem. And I'm pretty sure this is not the be-all and end-all. There's probably a lot more than can be done, but this was the quickest, simplest way, and it seems to have worked quite well for me. So anyway, stay well out there, and I'll see you in my next video.